What a strange thing it is to have a hearing about Minnesota that doesn't address what's on the front pages of every newspaper about Minnesota: the violent and unwelcome federal occupation of its largest city by the chairman's political party, an occupation that has already caused the deaths at federal agents' hands of 2 American citizens and left many more injured, and that is roundly criticized by law enforcement leaders, including those in Texas, as unprofessional and dangerous. That may explain why elected officials in Minnesota have something better to do today. No mention today of 100 violations by agents there of federal court orders. No mention of the sacking of the vain little commander of that operation. No mention of the venomous lies told by Secretary Noem about the shooting victims without investigation or sympathy, as their bereaved families grappled with grief at their deaths. I've done law enforcement briefings, and Rule 1 is to tell the truth. What a strange thing it is to have a hearing about fraud in Minnesota that doesn't acknowledge that the wide-ranging investigation and prosecutions of $9 billion worth of fraud in that state began years ago under the Biden administration. No mention of the fact that the current administration drove out the career prosecutor leading those cases when it demanded he investigate the victim of an ICE shooting, not the agent who did the shooting. 14 prosecutors have left the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office in the past month. And what a strange thing it is to have a hearing about fraud that doesn't look at the colossal fraud perpetrated by this administration, starting with the president's own conviction of 34 felony fraud counts, the dismissal of inspectors general who watch out for fraud, the destruction of the Justice Department components that prevent and prosecute corruption, the self-serving billion-dollar crypto deals that line the pockets of the president and his family, the pay-to-play presidential pardons that strip fraud victims of their restitution, the disabling of consumer protection offices and regulators that defend the public against fraud. It is a carnival of fraud and self-dealing. On top of all this, the biggest fraud ever perpetrated in America is going on right now, facilitated and accelerated by the Trump administration and implemented through a massive, semi-covert climate denial fraud operation and a twinned, massive, semi-covert, dark money political corruption operation. This fraud costs Americans hundreds of billions of dollars every year, $770 billion annually, according to the International Monetary Fund, $820 billion annually in healthcare costs from another report. Climate-related disasters cost the United States $115 billion last year. How was this fraud done? This long-running fraud operation began when oil industry scientists reported to their bosses the dangers of fossil fuel pollution, and instead of responsible stewardship, the bosses hid the reports. That was stage one. Stage two moved from hiding to purposefully misleading. A federal court shut down Big Tobacco's fraud operation to mislead the public about the dangers of tobacco. That tobacco fraud operation was quickly repurposed by Big Oil into its own fraud operation to mislead the public about the dangers of its product. Stage three kicked off with Citizens United, which gave the fossil fuel industry the ability to spend unlimited amounts of political money and spend it secretly. This dark money political corruption operation swiftly strangled bipartisanship on climate. Before stage three, there were multiple bipartisan climate bills in the Senate, and John McCain ran for president on a legitimate climate platform. All of that was killed by fossil fuel dark money. Now we're in the most dangerous stage, where the corruption is so entrenched that the fossil fuel industry can infiltrate and weaponize the federal government as its own industry tool to defeat energy competitors whose product is cleaner, safer, and cheaper. But no Republican dares talk about that problem any longer. Such is the party's dependence on those big fossil fuel donors. President Trump asked the fossil fuel companies for a $1 billion campaign slush fund in 2024, and they expect and got a return on their investment. Quid pro quo. The lies and fraud are legion, but to use just one Rhode Island-based example, senior cabinet officials continually assert that offshore wind is unaffordable when the opposite is true. Anyone reading the contract can see that Revolution Wind will bring 9.9 cent kilowatt hours to an 18-cent kilowatt-hour grid. The administration's weaponized attacks, rejected as pretextual, went 0 for 5 in federal court, including before a Trump appointee. Instead of focusing on this massive fraud, or holding the administration accountable for the monumental levels of fraud and corruption in its own ranks, a Texas chairman holds a hearing on fraud in Minnesota, which is neither the biggest issue in Minnesota nor the biggest example of fraud. There's a biblical saying about the mote in another's eye and the beam in your own from the Sermon on the Mount. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own? Asked Jesus. I will leave it at that.